Hi, and welcome to episode 27 of the Well Bible Reading Podcast. I'm so glad that you're part of this journey that we're taking through the Bible together, reading the same chapter every day, Monday through Friday, reflecting on it on the weekends. And right now we find ourselves in the book of Exodus chapters 26, 27, and 28 this week, and then Psalm chapter 26 and Matthew chapter 26. As usual, there's a lot going on there, so I want us to kind of get right to it. I'm bringing Craig and Amber to join me. Craig and Amber, thanks for being here.
Hey.
Hey, everybody.
Yeah, I know you guys have studied this really hard this week, and I just wanted to kind of set up the kind of the framework of how we're seeing this what's going on in Exodus. We're getting into this place, guys, in Exodus that's real easy to kind of drop out because it's a lot of detail, and you may be wondering, why is this important? Why am I having to read all this about what everything's made of and how they're supposed to make it? But what I want you to see, this kind of overarching theme through here, is this God who, number one, is super, super important. That's why the detail. You focus on detail with things that are super important. And so all of this detail is just showing that this worship of Yahweh, it's setting up the worship life of the community, and that's super important. So you have, on the one hand, the super importance of God, and then on the other hand, this God who is moving. This is the God who is always on the move. Everything is being built to be portable, to be able to take it down and then move and then set it back up. And so you see all these details about how you're supposed to build it so that you can move. And so I think that's super important. We'll talk more about that in a little while. But hey, guys, why don't you just kind of join me in? Amber, just share with me some of the things that you saw kind of from these three chapters.
All right. Yeah. So I'm so excited about this week because I like the challenge of when things seem maybe like hard to get through, or maybe even like, oh, this is so boring. Why all these details? I start getting like excited, but there's something hidden here. And I can't wait. I hope that we are able to do it justice this week and get you some excitement to get through the next few weeks. Last week I mentioned briefly that right here in this section of the tabernacle, there are 7 divine speeches to Moses from God. And those are really important, these 7 divine speeches. And then I started going back to study this more, and there's a lot happening. So this is going to be very general over all through the tabernacle. So last week, this week, and next week's readings, this will be related. What I found, with some help of a Jewish scholar, a book that I read, is that during these 7 speeches, during speech number 1 is where you have all the furnishings that you see mentioned, starting last week's reading and into this week's readings. You have 7 things listed, 7 items listed of furnishings during the speech number 1. And at the very end of those 7 things that are listed, there's this little instruction about the lights being lit, the special oil and these lights being lit, and they're supposed to be for every morning and every evening. So remember that. It's like you're supposed to think of creation, right? So then there was morning, then there was evening. There was evening, there was morning, first day, right? So
Yes.
there's step number 1. And then you have these 2 long sections of these 2 priest information. These are describing the priest garments. There's 7 things listed during these priestly garments. And then after that, you have the them being consecrated, and that's a 7-day process to be consecrated.
Right.
And then at the end of these priestly information, there's another section of instructions about the daily sacrifice, the daily offering, the one that is for no one, but yet for everyone, right? It's the one that happens every morning and every evening.
Right.
So there you go. You have it again. And then after that, you have 7 more instructions, y'all. It's incredible. This is so intentional. Don't miss it. This is so intentional. You have 7 more instructions about the tabernacle, like how to wash, who's going to create it, who's going to, what type of oils and seasonings you're supposed to go find for the burning of incense. Like, it's very detailed. There's 7 more instructions that happen. This is a heavenly place that they're trying to create on earth. And that's what you're supposed to see. This is structured. It is highly, highly important. God wants to have an heaven on earth moment meet, just like Eden. That's why you keep seeing all these Eden imagery of, then there was morning, then there was evening, all these beautiful items. God wants to dwell with his people once again in a fallen state. And he has to do that to protect not only him, for a holy God to come on earth, but he's protecting them from himself. And the priestly thing stuck in the middle is also really important. Probably don't have time for today, but just know that with the seven, and the priest in the middle, that's incredibly important. Don't miss it.
Yeah, that's a good point as far as what he is setting up here. The picture is
Yeah,
he's setting up the worship life of Israel, this
right.
meeting with God, and it was super kind of important and sacred. The vestments that he describes, those became extremely sacred. They were believed to have this incredible power, and they had this incredible power over the people. Even the Romans saw that when the Romans conquered Israel, they knew very quickly that they had to take over the religious system because that's where the power was, and it was in the high priest. And so they basically took the high priest, the Hyrcanus family, or it was kind of the priestly family, and they took it basically away from them. Jonathan was one of the last ones that the people adored, and they wanted him. He was kind of in that family, that line of priestly line. But what Rome would literally do, they allowed the high priest to stay the high priest, but they would literally keep the vestments in Caesarea under lock and key, right? And only let him wear them on special occasions because they saw the power that there was with this attachment to that meant the presence of God to them. That
Right.
meant something super, super important. That's really a good catch. So Craig, what did you kind of see from these chapters? Some things that popped out at you?
Yeah, I'd call out a couple of things to piggyback on what you both said. Springboarding on your point, Ellis, about why is there so much detail here? Why is this so important? I would also ask a question of why is it important to be written down? Right? I mean, you talked last week about foundational literature when we talked about the Ten Commandments and the Decalogue, but here there's more detail than just Ten Commandments. There's detail that ends up being very useful and educational to the exiled Israelites in Babylon centuries later, and the post-exilic community as they come back to Jerusalem after they're freed by Cyrus. So they can come in and understand what the portable temple, or as Amber said last week, this tent on the go was designed to be like. It's a reminder of who God is. He's mobile. He's on the move, as you said, Ellis, and this is what it means to set up a space to worship God. And it's not a space that God needs to be present, but it's a place that humans need to come in and worship God and understand who He is. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would call out is springboarding off of Amber's excellent job last week and more into this week also of laying out what the tabernacle is for, but also the various aspects of its layout and how it mirrors Eden. But I want to discuss some of the items in the tabernacle itself. And to do this, I'll need to backtrack a little bit to Exodus 25. I ran out of time last week, so I want to cover some of these elements. There's 5 elements in the tabernacle itself that have power and provision for the people of God. And through these, we'll see that they ultimately culminate in Jesus, but we'll see the following characteristics of God. The Word of God, His reconciliation with His people, God's provision, the light of God's presence, and of course, God's holiness. So what I mean by all that is we get into specifics as we see the specifications for the Ark of the Covenant. And the Ark of the Covenant is to provide a place for the testimonies, or the Hebrew word edut, probably not saying that right, but it's E-D-U-T. These testimonies that give Israel's membership in a community of God, give it its identity. Secondly, the mercy seat. The mercy seat has for its explicit purpose, a place of meeting to receive the commandments. It's a place to provide implicit, purposeful covering. And this ultimately comes into aspects of atonement that become important later on. Thirdly, the table for bread of the presence. The table has on it perpetually the bread of the presence. And this, whether it's an offering to God or meant to be representative of sustainment for the people themselves, it's an invitation for the people to come in God's presence. And then fourthly, the golden lampstand, of course, where there's light, and in this symbolic gesture is symbolic of the light of God, and that the darkness of the people's sins are not going to be doused. They're going to be covered by God's light, and God will shine through them. And then lastly, the veil. In creation, God separated, another Hebrew word, badal, B-A-D-A-L. God separated in creation this from that, light from darkness, the waters, day from night. And the same verb, badal, reoccurs in Exodus 26:31, through verses 33 for the veil, talking about the veil, to bait all the inner sanctum from the outer sanctum. And this veil is made to protect God's people from the overwhelming holiness of his presence in the inner holy of holies of God's heaven on earth, so that once a year the high priest can then come in into God's throne room, always covered with blood, to then make atonement for the sins of the people of God. And of course, we know in the crucifixion, we'll see in a week or two when we get there in Matthew, Jesus rips the veil through his crucifixion, or as a result of his crucifixion and his death, removing this division from the holy God and his unholy people.
Yeah, no, that's a great description, Craig. And it's interesting to me too. You mentioned Matthew 26, Jesus in Matthew 26, 27, 28. You have the crucifixion, resurrection, and all that scene with the temple. The temple plays a huge role in Jesus in what we call Passion Week or Holy Week. It's constantly there. Jesus is constantly there, and he in some ways is attacking it. It seems to me that all this stuff that both of you have talked about, really the temple, the tabernacle, the original tabernacle, was this place that where you find the presence of God. All of it, and it has this kind of degrading in materials. It's like concentric circles. The closer you get to the Holy Holies, everything's gold. Everything's made of gold. And the further away you get, it's more brass and silver. And so there's this degradation of materials. It's this idea that the closer you get to God, the higher the value and so forth and the importance. And so you have this in the tabernacle, and it's on the move. They take it down, they put it back up, and it follows them everywhere, right? It's almost like once they get into the promised land, they establish themselves and they make a permanent place for this tabernacle that eventually it becomes Jerusalem. It's not there at first, but eventually David, or actually Solomon, his son, builds that first temple in Jerusalem. And now it's this place that doesn't move, that doesn't go anywhere. That's just there. And something starts to happen with that, I think. They begin to worship the place instead of worshiping the God, right? And there's this corruption that comes around that by Jesus's day was extremely corrupt. The whole temple enterprise was corrupt. There's a corruption that takes place when you remove the mobility of God and you start worshiping a place. It's real easy to worship a place, right? And that's why it's so important for us to understand the church is not a place. The church is the people. We're on the move. We're always on the go. We're spreading out all over the whole world. So those are excellent.
It's almost like they were trying to pin God down.
Yeah, that's right. He's right here, and we've cornered the market on God. He's right here, and he's ours. He belongs to us, right? There became that idea. Yeah.
I also think our human nature is to be in awe of things that we can physically see.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have a beautiful temple. I mean, Herod, he did it up. I mean, it was like what today would be like one of the 7 wonders of the world. I mean, in today's sense, like it's beautiful, well done, and it's all worthy. And all of a sudden, you start worshiping the awe of the building rather than the awe of the creator. Going back to the mercy seat, I think it's important for people to recognize that seat is supposed to be God's literal throne. A throne, and that is not uncommon to the pagan people all around. They would too have their gods on thrones in a very similar sense, but this is very different because their thrones would have a physical object or image of that God on that throne. And what you have is you have cherubim who are surrounding the mercy seat, and which is similar to what the Sphinx would be in Pharaoh's day, like the guardian of the God. That's sort of kind of the same image. You have these guardians, and then you have the throne. But our Ark of the Covenant has no image. It doesn't have an image because it will go against the covenant, the first commandment, and second commandment.
Yep.
And so you got to recognize that this is not uncommon to have a throne of your gods you worship, but this one doesn't have an image. And here's what I think I hit this week. It's because we are his very image. Mm-hmm. We are his image. And so a image of himself is walking into that room, and we are his image, and let's not forget that he is all things. He doesn't have an image. We bear his image. And that is, so when we worship something else, we're worshiping something that's below us because we are his image.
Good. No, that's a great point. Excellent point on what he's trying to set up from the very beginning. Yeah. The reason for having no image before him. He's already placed his image inside of us.
Exactly.
Yeah, very, very good. Okay, guys, anything else before we move to Matthew 26?
I have
Go
one
ahead.
more thing.
Go ahead, Amber. Go ahead.
You have in verse 22 in chapter 26, you have this instructions of which direction the tent should face. It
Yeah.
says, in the rear of the tabernacle is westward, and you shall make 6 frames. Y'all, this is important because I love my directions.
Yeah, east-west.
East and west. So what you have is you have the rear of it on the west side, which means the entrance is facing east. And so what happens is you have somebody that is not fully they are sinful, right? The priests do the best they can. They have things that they have to do. They have to go extra steps, but they still have to be covered with blood, right? They still have all these things they have to wear to guard themselves to enter a holy place. And yet they're moving from west to east. They're moving away from God's presence towards God's presence when they're entering the Holy of Holies. And it's just a beautiful image. It's consistent. It's just consistent throughout the scriptures.
Yep. Very good. Yes. Good catch, Amber. And just shows us that what he's setting up there is a picture of our worship, our coming into the presence of God. And it's a concentric circles thing of getting closer and closer to him. So that's really what it was all about from the very beginning. And we tend to make it about other things. Great. Okay. Well, Matthew 26 also has a lot of stuff. No way we can cover it all in the time we have left. You have the plot against Jesus kind of hatching with Judas. Jesus is anointed at Bethany. The Last Supper, where Jesus predicts they're going to betray him. Peter's going to betray him. Peter says, no way. The moment at Gethsemane, which is one of my most favorite moments of Jesus, is this struggle that he's having internally. Jesus is arrested, and then he goes before the Sanhedrin. Peter disowns him. All of this is happening in this one chapter, so there's no way. So just guys, what is it kind of out of all those things? They're all big moments and important to the whole story, but what kind of leapt out at you as being kind of critically important? Craig, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, thanks. So I'll start with verses 14 through 25, setting up the story of Judas's betrayal of Jesus.
Yep.
And this is so easy for us to judge, and in many ways we should, because he betrayed Jesus and everything our Lord stands for. So there's some judgment there, but Judas also should give us pause, because we are more like him than we initially realized. And I'd like to share a little bit of a lengthy quote from N.T. Wright, but I promise it's going to be worth it because there's some huge insights here. N.T. Wright writes in respect to this passage the following: I suspect that even if we were to transport all that we know about psychology now back into the first century and gain an interview with Judas on the day of the Last Supper, and even if he cooperated and answered all of our questions, we still wouldn't get to the bottom of it. We still wouldn't get to a single identifiable motive that would make us say, of course, that's why he did it. Evil isn't like that. It's ultimately absurd. Evil is ultimately absurd. That's part of the danger and its darkness. It wasn't just the money, though that may have helped. If he was going to break ranks with others, he would need something to help him get started on a different life somewhere else. But the decision to hand Jesus over probably came first. It may have been partly an angry disappointment at the fact that Jesus, having caused such a stir in Jerusalem, was now talking again about going to his death, instead of planning a great moment when he would take over Jerusalem and become king. Maybe Judas had hoped, as James and John had hoped, that he would be on Jesus's right hand in the new regime. After all, he was the group's treasurer, trusted and valued. Maybe he'd been cherishing all sorts of plans for what he would do when the kingdom came. So who knows? N.T. Wright goes on. We certainly don't know. And frankly, I'm happy not to peer down that murky well for too long. I might see reflections that I find disturbing. And last paragraph. Jesus was going to his death wounded by wounds common to humanity: greed, lust, ambition. All kinds of natural drives and desires turned in on themselves rather than doing the outward-looking work the Creator intended them to do. When we say that Jesus died because of our sins, we don't just mean that in some high-flown abstract sense. We mean that what put him to death on the cross was precisely the sins that we not only commit, but that we wallow in. It isn't me, is it, Master, that all the disciples asked? Only when you have asked that with the disciples, knowing that it might have well been you, can you begin to appreciate what it meant for Jesus to sit at that table and share the Passover meal with them, with Judas too, or what it means that he has promised to share that feast with us as well.
Yeah, that's good. Judas is a complicated figure and very difficult to really understand what was going on with him. Obviously, he had a very different vision of what Jesus had come to do, as did the other disciples. Peter was no different, actually. And Peter, when and it's in this chapter, the scene where he goes to Gethsemane, and it's really interesting. This I always talk about reading it, being careful how you read things, because you had two people come to Jesus that night as he's being arrested. One is coming with a sword and the other's coming with a kiss. Which one's the friend and which one's the enemy? As it turns out, it's the one with the kiss that was the enemy, and the one with the sword that was the friend. But Peter also breaks out the sword. He's ready for the revolution to start as well. He kind of had that same image of what Jesus was supposed to be doing, is let the revolution begin. We're going to win this thing. Let me pull out my sword and protect Jesus. So they weren't that much different. All the disciples betrayed Jesus. Judas's was the most, it seems like, was the most radical betrayal, but they all did in one way or another. So that's excellent. That's a great scene. So, Amber, what did you pull out?
Yeah, so I love this very next paragraph about the Passover. So the disciples are walking. They're like, "So where are we doing this Passover anyways?" They have no idea. Like, they're here in Jerusalem to celebrate Passover, and yet they have no idea where they're going to celebrate this. This seems like a missing piece of the puzzle. And they're like, "So where are we doing this thing?" And I love this so much because a few weeks ago I mentioned when they were entering into Jerusalem. This is several podcasts ago.
Mhm.
This is only a few days ago in the
The
story.
triumphal entry, yeah.
Exactly. That's only a few days ago in the story, but
Right.
it's several podcasts ago. I mentioned that story of the triumphal entry, but before he came in on the donkey, he sends two disciples and he's like, "Just go to that city and there's going to be a donkey here. And if someone says, it's like a code word, like if
Yeah,
someone
tell him
says
this.
something,
Yeah.
I made a point. He pre-planned that moment. He
Mhm.
knew and he was doing it to fulfill scripture. He's to fulfill prophecy.
Mhm.
And so here you have it again. Jesus, they asked that question. Jesus is like, "Aha, here's my plot. My plot is at the thicken right here." He goes, "I have sent two disciples. You're going to go to this town. You're going to see this guy with the jar of water." Mind you, it was not that common for men to be carrying giant jars of
Yeah.
water. That was the women's job. They're the ones that did the cooking. They needed lots of water. Men would carry small leather, I don't know, sacks of water.
Yeah.
But they
Oh.
would not carry large amounts. This is not like, you're
No,
not just going to randomly see this man. Like, this
no,
is
it was the signal.
it is a
He's
signal.
the lady in red. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes, it's a great example. It's
Mhm.
almost as this, like, Jesus has had this worked out with this master of this home, and the master has sent his servant out to sit and wait for the disciples with this jar of water, waiting,
Yep.
just waiting. And then it happens. And the
Yep.
moment it happens, it is a pre-planned. So my question was in my mind, well, why? I'm a questioner. Maybe y'all know this by now.
Yeah.
So why? And so I started thinking through it. I think what Craig just said about Judas is the why. Judas had already betrayed him at this point, and Jesus knows it. But yet, the betrayal had to happen, y'all. It had to happen. It has been told in the Old Testament. It has been told through, Jesus has said it multiple times in his own ministry. Has to happen. The
Mhm.
betrayal has to happen, but not yet. This was a perfect opportunity in a small upper room or anywhere to have the Passover. It was a great opportunity to arrest Jesus in just a small group, not in public, not many people around, kind of quiet, hush hush. It would have been the perfect opportunity. So the reason why it was so pre-planned and not told by any of the disciples was to keep it from everyone, including
Mhm.
Judas at this
Yeah.
moment. Judas could not know where this was going to happen because Jesus has to have the Passover meal. This has to happen. He has so many things, symbolic things, and important messages he has to tell us, and we can't miss it. We can't miss it.
Yes. Yeah, you're absolutely right. There were a lot of things going on that were very clandestine at that time,
Mm.
during that time period. It was code words and kind of hiding. And Jesus, the scriptures tell us that Jesus was on the run before this. He was not able to go into cities anymore because they were after him. They were looking for him. And there's no doubt that they would have loved to have arrested him in that small room, in out real quick. And by the way, also capture all of his disciples at the same time because they
Right.
wanted them too. It would have been the perfect moment, and Jesus knows this, and so he's operating this almost spy novelish way, right, with secret code words and signals and symbols and so forth. And you mentioned the Lord's Supper, how important it is, and what
Yes.
Jesus does there, right, is he redefines he redefines the Passover meal. The Passover meal had always been about liberation, their liberation from bondage in Egypt. It had always been about their liberation. But here, Jesus is going to say it's now about your spiritual liberation, about your true eternal liberation in what he's going to do. So he changes the meaning. It's super, super important. The supper is. Yeah. Did you guys have anything to throw in about the supper or or Gethsemane after the supper? Anything going on with there?
Real quick, and just kind of piggybacking again on what you were just saying, Ellis, these meals, these Passover meals require special food and drink. They require special words to reenact, to bring Israel's history forward into the present time so that the current people enacting the ritual were grafted into the story of the Passover.
Mhm.
And as part of that, Jesus, as the head of the household, would be expected to lead them through this meal. And he does, but unexpectedly, as he starts to work through the words and the actions, he starts doing and saying things that make it about himself. He starts talking about himself. This is my body. This is my blood of the covenant. And so he's to your point, he's taken Israel's history, bringing it into himself and making himself the new Israel. He's been saying this all along, but now it's clear.
This is huge. This is so huge. First of all, it had to be huge awkward to be like biting the bread and you're like, this is my body. You're like, like, first of all, that had to be like Jesus likes to say these things and you're like shocked. But here's what I think I saw this week that I'd never seen before. And it just blew me away. Is that right here, Jesus says specifically about the cup, about his blood. It says, this is my blood of the covenant. That's what Jesus says here, my blood of the covenant. And I was like, oh, that language sounds really familiar since I just read through Exodus. And it sounds really familiar. So I went back and looked, and it is not the same. In Exodus, it says, the blood of my covenant. Hold on, don't miss it. In the Old Testament, to be a new covenant people of Yahweh, to be the Israelites, to be a new covenant people, it said you have to have the blood of my covenant. Jesus says, my blood of the covenant. He switches the my and the. Don't miss it. Jesus is the new way to be a new covenant people, and it's his blood, not the blood. And it is a powerful moment. When I saw that switch of the and the my life was rocked this week.
Yeah, that's awesome. No, I love that, and it is a powerful statement connecting these two powerful images. So you have this Old Testament image that has been so powerful to Israel. It happened 3,000 years ago, and they're still talking about it, still celebrating it, still honoring that liberation out of Egypt. It's that deep and strong, and yet Jesus ties to it that it's now his blood of the covenant that is powerful. It's a super important tie to that for the early church, especially, which came out of Judaism. So they just have a connection to it that's hard for non-Jews to really understand. Sometimes that connection to that piece is super, super important.
I noticed that, you have all the traditional things of the Passover. It seems like a kind of a rush, like maybe they're having Passover a little earlier than everyone else, because we know that what happens on Passover, he's being crucified during Passover. So it seems like him and his disciples are having this Passover early. So two things I noticed. One, they're having it earlier than everyone else, and there's no lamb mentioned in this. There's no lamb mentioned this. One, I don't think it had time to be prepared because they were having it early. That's just the logical. But secondly, I think it's so symbolic because Jesus is going to be that lamb. But I don't miss the fact that they're having the Passover meal, but there's not a lamb mentioned intentionally. Don't miss it.
Yeah. John in his gospel really wanted the sacrifice of the lambs for the Passover, that he wanted Jesus dying at the same time they were pacified. They were sacrificing the lambs. You can hear the lambs bleeding in the background as Jesus is being crucified. That imagery is really powerful and important. That, and of course the imagery of the scapegoat, which is a whole other imagery thing that's going on that you have here. And so Jesus goes from there, this moment with his disciples. Now they move across the Kidron Valley, up the hill on the east side, the Mount of Olives, to a garden, Gethsemane, up is an olive grove, really is what it is, overlooking Jerusalem, and he has this another moment, right, where this really the Gethsemane is sometimes called the crucifixion before the crucifixion.
Yeah.
So this is the moment really just where Jesus crucified himself to his own wants, his own desires, his own flesh to submit to God. It's a super powerful moment when he's sweat is pouring off his face like big great drops of blood, which means he was sweating profusely. His face, you get this image of his face being contorted. It was almost the opposite of the transfiguration. You have the beautiful transfiguration and you have the almost grotesque transformation as Jesus is in agony. But it really points to the sacrifice. This was a sacrifice. Jesus loved life like any of us do, right? And he's naturally going to cling to it like any of us are going to cling to life and not want to give up that life. He didn't want to give up his life here on earth, in the flesh. He had to crucify himself, metaphorically speaking, to be able to do that. I think that when they were nailing Jesus on the cross, you can tell by the statements he makes. We'll get to it at some point, a couple of podcasts from now. But he's already crucified himself. He's already made the decision, and it's kind of a done deal. Jesus, in some ways, throws himself up on that cross, allowing himself to do that. Yeah. Did you guys grab anything from the rest of the Matthew? You have the Jesus arrested. Talked a little bit about that already before the Sanhedrin.
I just wanted to piggyback on what you just said about this garden moment, is that you just left a moment where it seems almost like Jesus is delaying the betrayal, delaying the capture. You almost kind of get a sense of it. And then you get to this story, you're like, oh wait, he wasn't delaying it at all. His flesh wanted to run in this moment, but yet he stood there and he took it because he knew it had to happen. His flesh is telling him to run. His divine said, I have to be here. It's part of the plan. It has to happen. And so it wasn't that he was delaying it. It was there was so much to be said. And it is now time. It is
right.
Now time.
Yeah, absolutely. The Mount of Olives, and especially Gethsemane at the top of that mount, is really, you go down the other side, you go down one side and you can escape into the wilderness of Judah. You get down the other side and you're headed right into Jerusalem and the mouth of the lion, so to speak. So Jesus at that moment, he still could have gotten away from it if he had wanted to. So, hey guys, we're out of time. Sorry about that. We're just out of time, but we look forward to seeing you guys next week. I pray that you guys will read the scriptures very carefully this week. Stick with us, especially through Exodus. There's so much stuff there. The symbolism is super important for all the reasons we've talked about. So I believe that God is going to speak to you. Just give yourself to him as you read, and I pray that God will bless you this week. God bless you until we see you again.